In a world where first impressions often define us, sometimes the most extraordinary people hide behind the most ordinary facades. What happens when society's assumptions about weakness and strength are completely shattered? When the person everyone overlooks turns out to be someone the most powerful military in the world desperately needs. This is the true story of a woman who endured mockery, ridicule, and dismissal from her community, only to discover that her unique gifts would make her invaluable to her country. It's a tale that will make you question everything you think you know about hidden talents, the power of perseverance, and the danger of judging someone by their appearance. Prepare to witness how one moment of public humiliation became the catalyst for an extraordinary journey that would change not just one woman's life, but potentially save countless others. The summer heat hung thick over the small town of Millbrook like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of oppressive August afternoon that made everyone move a little slower, speak a little quieter, and seek shade wherever they could find it. The annual county fair was in full swing, bringing together families from all the surrounding communities for 3 days of carnival rides, cotton candy, and friendly competition. Among the various attractions was the shooting range booth, run by Jake Morrison, a gruff ex-military man who took pride in challenging anyone brave enough to try their hand at marksmanship. Sarah Bennett had lived in Millbrook her entire 42 years. She worked at the local library, lived alone in a modest house inherited from her grandmother, and had developed a reputation as the town's quiet, unremarkable spinster. People knew her as the woman who always wore cardigans even in summer, who spoke softly when she spoke at all, and who seemed to fade into the background at social gatherings. She had mousy brown hair that she kept in a simple ponytail, thick glasses that had gone out of style decades ago, and a slight build that made her appear fragile. Most folks in town had formed their opinion of Sarah years ago and never bothered to look deeper. On this particular Saturday, Sarah had ventured out to the fair mainly because her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had practically dragged her along. Mrs. Henderson was a well-meaning widow who worried constantly about Sarah's solitary lifestyle and made it her personal mission to get her neighbor out of the house more often. They had spent the afternoon walking through the craft booths and watching the pie-eating contest when they came upon the shooting range. The booth was busy, with a small crowd gathered around watching various townspeople try their luck at hitting targets with vintage military rifles. Jake Morrison stood behind the counter, his arms crossed and a skeptical expression on his weathered face as he watched person after person fail to hit the center targets that would win them the larger prizes. The rifles he provided were authentic military surplus weapons, heavy and requiring proper stance and technique to fire accurately. "Come on, anyone else brave enough to try?" Jake called out to the crowd. $20 gets you 5 shots. Hit 3 center targets and win that giant teddy bear for your sweetheart. Several young men had already tried and failed, missing the targets entirely or hitting the outer rings at best. The rifles were clearly challenging even experienced hunters in the crowd. Jake seemed to enjoy watching people struggle with the weapons, occasionally offering condescending advice that rarely helped. It was then that Mrs. Henderson got what she would later call a mischievous idea. Before Sarah could protest, her neighbor was pushing her forward toward the booth. "Sarah here would like to try," Mrs. Henderson announced loudly, causing several heads to turn. Sarah felt her cheeks burn red with embarrassment as all eyes focused on her. "Oh, no, I couldn't," Sarah stammered, trying to back away from the counter. "I don't know anything about guns." But Mrs. Henderson had already placed a $20 bill on the counter and was beaming at her friend encouragingly. "Nonsense, dear. It's just for fun. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake looked at Sarah with barely concealed amusement. She stood there in her pale yellow cardigan buttoned all the way up, clutching her small purse with both hands, looking like she might faint at any moment. Her glasses reflected the fluorescent lights of the booth, making her appear even more owl-like and helpless. "Ma'am, these are real military rifles," Jake said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "They're not exactly beginner-friendly. Maybe you'd prefer the ring toss game over there?" A few chuckles rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Someone in the back called out, "Let the lady try, Jake. Could be entertaining." More laughter followed, and Sarah felt herself shrinking inward. She had always hated being the center of attention, and now she found herself in exactly the kind of situation she normally went to great lengths to avoid. But Mrs. Henderson's encouraging hand on her shoulder and the expectant faces around her made it impossible to simply walk away. "I suppose I could try," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the carnival noise. Jake shrugged and reached under the counter for one of the rifles. It was a vintage M1 Garand, the same type used by American forces in World War II. The weapon was substantial, weighing nearly 10 pounds when fully loaded. He set it on the counter with a heavy thunk. "All right, lady, here's how this works," Jake began, his explanation deliberately slow as if he were talking to a child. "You pick up the rifle, point it down range at those targets, and pull the trigger. Try to hit the red centers if you can. The safety is already off, so be careful not to point it at anyone." Sarah approached the counter hesitantly and looked down at the rifle. It was indeed intimidating, much larger and heavier than she had expected. The wood stock was worn smooth from years of use, and the metal components showed their age, despite being well-maintained. "Go ahead, pick it up," Jake encouraged, though his tone suggested he expected nothing but failure. Sarah reached for the rifle with obvious nervousness. Her small hands seemed to barely wrap around the stock, and when she lifted it, she immediately struggled with the weight. The crowd watched as she fumbled with the weapon, clearly uncertain about how to hold it properly. "Other end goes toward the target, sweetheart," someone called out, causing another wave of laughter. "You need to get it up to your shoulder," Jake instructed, though he made no effort to actually help her. "And for God's sake, don't point it at the crowd." Sarah attempted to raise the rifle to her shoulder, but her form was all wrong. She held it like someone who had never seen a gun before, let alone fired one. The butt of the rifle was positioned incorrectly against her shoulder, her stance was completely off balance, and her grip on the weapon looked precarious at best. She appeared to be struggling just to keep the heavy rifle pointed in the general direction of the targets. "Somebody should probably call an ambulance," a teenage boy said loudly. "This lady's about to knock herself over." The laughter was getting louder now, and Sarah could feel her face burning with embarrassment. She tried to adjust her position, but every movement seemed to make her stance worse. The rifle wobbled in her hands, and she had to constantly readjust her grip to keep from dropping it. "Maybe you should put both eyes open, ma'am," Jake suggested mockingly. "Might help you see the targets." "Is she even pointing it the right way?" another voice called out. $10 says she misses the entire target stand," someone else added. Sarah stood there, clearly overwhelmed and humiliated, holding the rifle in what appeared to be the most awkward and incorrect manner possible. She looked like every stereotype of someone who had no business handling a firearm. The crowd's amusement was palpable, with people nudging each other and pointing out various aspects of her poor form. "Take your time, dear," Mrs. Henderson said encouragingly, though even she seemed to be having second thoughts about pushing Sarah into this situation. "Actually, you know what?" Jake said, reaching as if to take the rifle back. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea. These weapons can have quite a kick, and I'd hate for someone to get hurt." But Sarah, despite her obvious discomfort and the crowd's mockery, had set her jaw with determination. She might not know the first thing about proper shooting stance or rifle handling, but she wasn't about to give up without at least attempting the 5 shots she had paid for. "I'd like to try." "Please," she said, her voice still quiet but with a firmness that surprised everyone, including herself. Jake shrugged again and stepped back, gesturing toward the targets. "All right then, it's your $20. 5 shots. Targets are 50 yards downrange. Fire when ready." The crowd fell into an expectant hush. everyone waiting to see just how spectacularly this mild-mannered librarian would fail. Some were already pulling out their phones, anticipating a moment worth recording. The teenagers in the group were barely containing their giggles, and even the adults seemed to be fighting back smiles. Sarah took a deep breath and tried once more to position the rifle correctly. From every angle, her form looked textbook wrong. She appeared to be someone who had learned everything about shooting from bad movies and had never received a moment of actual instruction. The way she held the weapon, stood, and aimed seemed almost comically incorrect to anyone with even basic firearms knowledge. "This ought to be good," someone whispered. "Poor lady doesn't know which end is which," another person murmured. "Should we be standing this close when she shoots?" a concerned parent asked, pulling their child slightly back from the booth. What happened next would become the talk of Millbrook for years to come, shared and reshared until it became local legend. But none of the people watching that day, not even Sarah herself, could have predicted just how dramatically this moment of public mockery would change everything. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah Bennett stood there, holding a rifle that seemed too big for her small frame, surrounded by a crowd that expected nothing but embarrassment from the town's quiet librarian. Little did they know they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the snickers and whispered comments from the crowd behind her. The weight of the rifle felt strange in her hands, unfamiliar yet somehow not entirely foreign. She had never held a gun before, at least not consciously, but something deep inside her seemed to recognize the feel of the weapon. Opening her eyes, she looked downrange at the targets. They were standard bullseye targets, black circles on white paper mounted on stands 50 yards away. To most people at the fair, 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles when it came to accuracy with an unfamiliar rifle. The center targets that Jake had mentioned were no bigger than dinner plates, and hitting them required precision that even experienced shooters sometimes struggled with. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am," Jake said, his tone making it clear he expected this to be over quickly and unsuccessfully. Sarah lifted the rifle again, and once more her stance looked completely wrong to everyone watching. She seemed to be fighting with the weight of the weapon, and her positioning appeared so awkward that several people in the crowd exchanged meaningful glances. Someone's phone was definitely recording now, capturing what they assumed would be a harmless but amusing failure. What none of them could see was what was happening behind Sarah's thick glasses. As she brought the rifle scope to her eye, something extraordinary occurred. The world around her seemed to shift and focus in a way she had never experienced before. The chatter of the crowd faded to a distant murmur. The carnival sounds became background noise, and her entire awareness narrowed to the sight picture in front of her. The scope revealed details about the targets that her naked eye could never have caught. She could see tiny imperfections in the paper, slight movements caused by the afternoon breeze, even the grain of the wood backing the targets. More surprising still was the strange calmness that settled over her entire body. Her hands, which had been trembling with nervousness just moments before, became steady. Her breathing, which had been quick and shallow from embarrassment, slowed to a natural, controlled rhythm. Most remarkable of all was the knowledge that seemed to flow into her mind without any conscious effort. She found herself automatically adjusting her grip on the rifle, making minute changes to her stance that felt completely natural despite contradicting everything the crowd could observe. Her body seemed to know things about shooting that her mind had never learned. "Come on, lady, we don't have all day," someone called out impatiently. Sarah ignored the voice completely. Through the scope, she could see exactly where the first shot needed to go. She could sense the wind direction and speed, calculate the slight drop of the bullet over the distance, and feel the precise moment when everything aligned perfectly. Her finger found the trigger, and she began to apply pressure with a smoothness that would have impressed a professional marksman. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that caused several people in the crowd to jump. The recoil, which should have knocked someone of Sarah's apparent inexperience completely off balance, seemed to have no effect on her at all. She absorbed it perfectly, maintaining her position and immediately preparing for the second shot. Downrange, a small puff of dust appeared behind the first target, and Jake reached for his binoculars to check the result. The crowd waited expectantly for confirmation of what they assumed was a complete miss. "Well, I'll be," Jake muttered, peering through his binoculars. He lowered them, looked at Sarah with confusion, then raised them again to double-check what he was seeing. "Did she hit it?" Mrs. Henderson asked hopefully. "She hit it all right," Jake replied slowly. "Dead center. Perfect bullseye." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people laughed, assuming Jake was joking with them. The idea that the awkward librarian who could barely hold the rifle properly had managed a perfect shot on her first attempt seemed impossible. "You're kidding," one of the teenage boys said. "No way she hit anything." But Sarah was already lining up her second shot, seemingly oblivious to the disbelief around her. Once again, she appeared to struggle with the rifle's weight and positioning, yet once again something remarkable happened when she brought the scope to her eye. The same supernatural calmness descended over her, the same inexplicable knowledge guided her movements, and the same perfect steadiness controlled her breathing. The second shot rang out, followed immediately by the third, fourth, and fifth in rapid succession. Sarah fired with a rhythm and precision that seemed to contradict everything about her appearance and demeanor. Each shot was taken with barely a pause between them, yet each was deliberate and controlled. The sound of the rifle firing echoed across the fairgrounds, causing people at other booths to look over and wonder what was happening. When the last shot was fired, Sarah lowered the rifle carefully and stepped back from the counter. She looked drained, as if the experience had taken something out of her. But there was also a strange light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She removed her glasses and cleaned them with a shaky hand, the adrenaline of what had just happened finally beginning to affect her. Jake was frantically looking through his binoculars, checking and rechecking each target. The crowd had fallen completely silent, sensing that something unusual had just occurred, but not yet understanding what. "Jake, what's the verdict?" someone finally called out. Jake lowered his binoculars and stared at Sarah with an expression of complete bewilderment. 5 shots, he announced slowly. 5 perfect bullseyes, dead center, every single one. The silence that followed was deafening. People looked at Sarah, then at Jake, then back at Sarah again. The woman standing before them looked exactly the same as she had 10 minutes earlier. Small, unassuming, dressed in her cardigan and clutching her purse. Nothing about her appearance had changed, yet she had just accomplished something that seemed impossible. "That's not possible," one of the men who had failed earlier said flatly. "There's no way. She was holding that rifle all wrong." "I'm telling you what I see," Jake replied, his voice carrying a note of defensiveness. 5 perfect shots. I've been running this booth for 8 years, and I've never seen shooting like that. "Let me see those binoculars," demanded Tom Bradley, a local hunter who considered himself an expert marksman. He had failed to hit even one center target during his earlier attempt. Tom grabbed the binoculars and studied the targets carefully. His expression changed from skepticism to confusion to something approaching awe. "Holy hell," he whispered. "She's right. Every single shot is dead center. Look at this grouping. They're all within an inch of each other." The binoculars were passed around the crowd, and each person who looked came away with the same shocked expression. The evidence was undeniable, yet it made no sense. The quiet librarian, who had appeared to know nothing about firearms, had just demonstrated marksmanship skills that bordered on the superhuman. "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah looked at her neighbor with genuine confusion. I don't know, she admitted. I've never shot a gun before in my life. I don't understand what just happened. Come on, scoffed one of the teenagers. Nobody shoots like that without training. You must have been practicing somewhere. I swear to you, I've never even held a gun before today, Sarah insisted, her voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable sincerity. I'm just as surprised as you are. The crowd began to buzz with conversation as people tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Some suggested it was a trick, though no one could explain how such a trick might work. Others proposed that Sarah had been lying about her inexperience, though everyone in Millbrook knew her well enough to know she wasn't the type to deceive anyone. Jake, meanwhile, was staring at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. As an ex-military man, he had seen exceptional marksmanship before, but what he had just witnessed went beyond exceptional. The precision, the consistency, the apparent ease with which she had made those shots despite her awkward form. It reminded him of something he had heard about during his service, stories that most soldiers dismissed as legends. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" "I suppose," Sarah replied, though she was clearly uncomfortable with all the attention. "Have you ever been in the military?" "No." "Any family members who were sharpshooters or snipers?" "My grandfather served in World War II, but he was a mechanic. He never talked about guns." Jake nodded thoughtfully. During his 20 years in the Army, he had heard whispers about certain individuals with natural abilities that defied explanation. People who could shoot with impossible accuracy despite having no training, who seemed to possess an innate understanding of ballistics and wind compensation that took most soldiers years to develop. The military had various names for such individuals: naturals, gifted, or in some circles, the more dramatic term, ghost shooters. Most people in the service dismissed these stories as exaggerations or myths. Jake had been one of those skeptics until today. Now, looking at Sarah Bennett standing there in her cardigan and thick glasses, he was beginning to think those stories might not have been myths after all. "Jake, give her the giant teddy bear," Tom Bradley said, finally lowering the binoculars. "She earned it fair and square." The crowd murmured agreement, though people were still staring at Sarah with a mixture of awe and confusion. Jake reached under the counter and retrieved the largest prize, a massive brown teddy bear that was nearly as tall as Sarah herself. "Here you go, ma'am," he said, handing over the prize. "Most impressive shooting I've ever seen." Sarah accepted the teddy bear awkwardly, clearly overwhelmed by its size and the attention she was receiving. The crowd began to disperse, people heading off to other parts of the fair while continuing to discuss what they had just witnessed. But Jake continued to watch Sarah intently, his mind racing with possibilities. As Sarah and Mrs. Henderson began to walk away, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not one of the cards for his booth, but a different card entirely, one he had never thought he would need to use. "Mrs. Bennett?" he called after her. "Wait just a moment." Sarah turned back, still struggling with the enormous teddy bear. "I'd like you to have this," Jake said, holding out the card. "There are some people who might be very interested in what you just did here today." Sarah looked at the card with confusion. It was plain white with just a phone number and a name: Colonel Marcus Webb, U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit. "I don't understand," she said. "Neither do I, completely," Jake admitted. "But I think you should make that phone call. What you just did? It's not normal, ma'am, it's special. And there are people who need to know about special." Little did anyone know that this simple county fair shooting booth had just identified one of the most naturally gifted marksmen in the country. And in a world where such skills were becoming increasingly valuable to national security, Sarah Bennett's quiet life was about to become anything but quiet. For 3 days after the county fair, Sarah Bennett carried Colonel Marcus Webb's business card in her purse like a secret she didn't know how to share. She would take it out periodically, study the simple white rectangle with its minimal information, and wonder what kind of people might be interested in her inexplicable performance at Jake's shooting booth. Each time she considered making the call, a voice in her head reminded her that she was just a small-town librarian who had somehow gotten lucky with 5 shots. Surely there was a reasonable explanation for what had happened, and surely it wasn't worth bothering a military officer about. The giant teddy bear sat in her living room like a monument to the strangest day of her life. Every time she looked at it, she was transported back to that moment when everything had seemed to slow down and focus, when knowledge she had never possessed seemed to flow through her naturally. She had tried to rationalize the experience, telling herself it must have been beginner's luck taken to an extreme, but deep down, she knew that what had happened defied any simple explanation. Mrs. Henderson had called twice to check on her, bubbling with excitement about Sarah's hidden talent and suggesting she take up competitive shooting. The calls had been well-meaning but uncomfortable, as Sarah found herself unable to explain something she didn't understand herself. Other neighbors had stopped by or waved with knowing smiles, and she realized that word of her shooting display had spread throughout Millbrook. She had gone from being invisible to being the subject of curious whispers wherever she went. It was on Wednesday evening. As Sarah sat in her kitchen eating a solitary dinner of soup and crackers, that she finally worked up the courage to dial the number on the card. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her old rotary phone, and she had to start over twice when she dialed the wrong digits due to nervousness. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Colonel Webb's office. Sergeant Martinez speaking." "Oh," Sarah stammered, suddenly realizing she hadn't planned what to say. "I'm sorry. I was looking for Colonel Webb. My name is Sarah Bennett, and I have his card, but I'm not really sure why I'm supposed to call." "One moment, please," Sergeant Martinez replied. There was a brief pause, then the sound of being transferred. "This is Colonel Webb." The voice that came on the line was deep and authoritative, but not unkind. "Miss Bennett, I've been expecting your call." "You have?" Sarah was genuinely surprised. "I'm not sure I understand. A man named Jake Morrison at the county fair gave me your card and said I should call, but I don't really know why." "Jake Morrison served under me for 6 years," Colonel Webb explained. "He's one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command, and when Jake calls to tell me he's witnessed something extraordinary, I listen. He told me about your performance at the fair. 5 perfect shots with no prior training. Is that accurate?" "I suppose so," Sarah said hesitantly, "though I'm sure it was just luck. I'd never shot a gun before, and I'm certainly not anyone special. Miss Bennett, in my 28 years of military service, I've trained thousands of marksmen. I've seen natural talent, I've seen the result of intensive training, and I've seen what happens when both come together. What Jake described to me isn't luck. It's something much rarer and much more valuable." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I don't understand what you mean by valuable." "Would you be willing to meet with me? I'm currently stationed at Fort Bragg, which I know is several hours from your location, but I'd be happy to drive up to meet you somewhere comfortable. I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might be of interest to you." "Opportunities?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Colonel, I think there's been some misunderstanding. I'm just a librarian. I live a very quiet life, and I'm not looking to change anything about it. Ms. Bennett, what if I told you that your country needs people with your particular abilities? What if I told you that there are situations where your natural talent could save lives?" The line was quiet for a long moment as Sarah processed what she was hearing. The idea that she could be needed by anyone, much less the United States military, seemed absurd. She was 42 years old, had never been anywhere or done anything remarkable, and had spent her entire adult life in the same small town doing the same quiet job. Colonel, I appreciate the call, but I think you're mistaken about me. I'm not military material. I'm not brave or strong or any of the things I imagine you need. Ms. Bennett, some of the finest soldiers I've known have been quiet, thoughtful people who never imagined themselves in uniform. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right despite being afraid, and strength comes in many forms. Sarah found herself thinking about her grandfather, the only family member she had ever heard stories about regarding military service. He had been a mechanic during World War II, as she had told Jake, but she remembered now that there had always been something mysterious about his war years. He had died when she was 12, but she could recall him sometimes getting a distant look in his eyes when anyone mentioned the war. Her grandmother had once mentioned that he had received some kind of medal, though she had never seen it, and he had never talked about what he had done to earn it. "Can I ask you something, Colonel?" Sarah said finally. "Of course. Have you ever heard of anyone else like me? Someone who could shoot well without training?" Colonel Webb was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. "Ms. Bennett, there are individuals who possess what we call natural aptitude for marksmanship that goes far beyond the normal range of human ability. Throughout military history, there have been soldiers who demonstrated skills that seemed almost supernatural. Most of the time, these individuals are discovered during basic training or combat situations. It's extremely rare to find someone like this in civilian life. So I'm not crazy. What happened at the fair was really unusual. Ms. Bennett, if Jake's description is accurate, what you did was beyond unusual. It was extraordinary. The kind of shooting he described typically requires years of training and thousands of rounds of practice. The fact that you accomplished it with no background in firearms suggests that you possess a natural ability that perhaps one person in a million might have. Sarah felt her heart racing. Part of her was thrilled to learn that she might possess some kind of special talent, but a larger part of her was terrified by the implications. Special abilities meant special responsibilities, and special responsibilities meant her quiet, predictable life would be over. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "I'd like you to come to Fort Bragg for a few days. We have some of the finest shooting instructors and facilities in the world. I'd like to see what you're truly capable of and discuss how your abilities might be put to use in service of your country." "Service of my country?" Sarah repeated slowly. "You mean like becoming a soldier?" "Not necessarily. The military has many needs, and there are various ways to serve. Some are traditional military roles, and others are civilian positions that work closely with military operations. I can't make you any specific offers until I better understand your capabilities. But I can tell you that people with your kind of natural talent are desperately needed." Sarah looked around her small kitchen, taking in the familiar surroundings that had been her world for so many years. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, filled her with anxiety. But there was something else stirring inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity about what she might be capable of. "If I came to Fort Bragg, it would just be to test my abilities? No commitments?" "Absolutely no commitments. Think of it as an evaluation that would be beneficial to both you and the military. You'd learn more about your natural gifts, and we'd learn whether there might be ways for you to use those gifts in service to others." "How long would it take?" 3 days would give us a good baseline. We'd cover basic marksmanship evaluation, advanced techniques, different weapons systems, and various scenarios. You'd also have the opportunity to meet with people who could explain different career paths that might interest you. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself on a military base, working with professional soldiers and sophisticated equipment. The image seemed absurd, but then again, so had the idea of making 5 perfect shots at the county fair. "Colonel, can I ask you something personal?" "Certainly." "Do you really think I could make a difference? I've spent my whole life feeling invisible and unremarkable. The idea that I might have something valuable to offer seems impossible. Ms. Bennett, in my experience, the people who make the greatest difference are often the ones who never expected to. They're the quiet ones who step up when they're needed, not because they're seeking glory or adventure, but because they have something unique to contribute. From what Jake told me about your character as well as your shooting, I believe you might be exactly that kind of person. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her with such respect and belief in her potential. If I agreed to come to Fort Bragg, when would you want me there? As soon as possible. This weekend, if you're available. I can arrange for transportation and accommodations. All you need to bring is yourself and an open mind. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would change everything. Colonel Webb, I'll do it. I'll come to Fort Bragg. Outstanding, Ms. Bennett. I'll have my aide contact you tomorrow with all the details. And Ms. Bennett? Yes, sir? Thank you. You're about to embark on a journey that could change not just your life, but potentially the lives of many others. I have a feeling you're going to surprise yourself with what you're capable of. After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the business card that had started it all. In 3 days, she would be on a military base, working with professional soldiers to test abilities she didn't understand. It was the most terrifying and exciting prospect she had ever faced. She looked over at the giant teddy bear in her living room, a reminder of the moment when her ordinary life had taken an extraordinary turn. Tomorrow she would need to arrange time off from the library, pack a bag, and prepare to discover who Sarah Bennett really was beneath the quiet exterior she had maintained for so many years. For the first time in decades, Sarah Bennett was about to stop being invisible. The military sedan that pulled up to Sarah's house on Saturday morning looked completely out of place on the quiet residential street of Millbrook. She watched through her front window as a young soldier in dress uniform got out and approached her door with purposeful strides. Her small suitcase sat by the entrance, packed with the few items she thought might be appropriate for a military base, though she had no real idea what to expect. Ms. Bennett, I'm Sergeant First Class Rodriguez. Colonel Webb sent me to escort you to Fort Bragg, the soldier said when she opened the door. He was polite and professional, but Sarah could see him taking in her appearance with barely concealed curiosity. She was wearing her best dress, a conservative navy blue outfit that she typically reserved for church, and carrying the same small purse she took everywhere. The 3-hour drive to Fort Bragg was mostly quiet, with Sergeant Rodriguez answering her nervous questions about base protocols and what her schedule would include. As they approached the main gate, Sarah felt her anxiety spike. The sight of armed guards, military vehicles, and personnel in uniform made the reality of her situation finally sink in. She was about to enter a world that was completely foreign to everything she had ever known. First time on a military installation, ma'am? Sergeant Rodriguez asked, noting her wide-eyed expression as they passed through security. Yes, Sarah admitted. I'm not entirely sure I belong here. Colonel Webb doesn't invite civilians to Fort Bragg unless he has good reason, the sergeant replied with a slight smile. If he thinks you belong here, you probably do. Sarah was taken to a guest quarters building that housed civilians working temporarily with the military. Her room was small but comfortable, with basic furnishings and a view of the training facilities where she could see soldiers conducting various exercises. After settling in, she was escorted to Colonel Webb's office for what he had described as an initial briefing. Colonel Marcus Webb was not what Sarah had expected. She had imagined someone imposing and intimidating, but the man who rose from behind his desk to greet her was soft-spoken and grandfatherly, with kind eyes and graying hair. He was clearly military through and through, from his perfect posture to his crisp uniform, but his manner immediately put her at ease. Miss Bennett, thank you for making the trip. I know this must feel overwhelming, but I want you to know that you're among people who respect what you've already shown us about your capabilities. Thank you, Colonel, though I'm still not entirely sure what I've shown anyone. That's exactly what we're here to find out. Over the next 3 days, we're going to conduct a series of evaluations to better understand your natural abilities and how they might be developed. I want to emphasize that this is entirely voluntary, and you can stop at any time if you become uncomfortable. Colonel Webb led her to a conference room where she was introduced to Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, the lead marksmanship instructor for the base's sniper training program. Sarah had expected another gruff military stereotype, but Sergeant Hayes was a woman in her 30s with an easy smile and a manner that immediately made Sarah feel more comfortable. "Ms. Bennett, I've been training marksmen for 15 years, Sergeant Hayes began. And I have to tell you, the story Colonel Webb shared about your performance at that county fair has me very curious. What we're going to do today is start with some basic evaluations to see what you're working with naturally." The first stop was the base's indoor shooting range, a sophisticated facility that bore no resemblance to Jake Morrison's county fair booth. Sarah was fitted with safety equipment and given a brief orientation on range protocols before being led to a shooting lane equipped with electronic targeting systems. "We're going to start simple," Sergeant Hayes explained, loading a standard military sidearm. "This is a Beretta M9, the standard service pistol. I want you to fire 10 rounds at that target at 25 yards. Don't worry about technique or form right now. I just want to see what happens when you shoot." Sarah accepted the pistol with the same nervousness she had felt at the fair. The weapon felt foreign in her hands, and she was acutely aware of Master Sergeant Hayes and 2 other instructors watching her every move. She approached the firing line and raised the weapon toward the target, immediately feeling the same awkward uncertainty she had experienced with the rifle. But then, just as before, something extraordinary happened. The moment she focused on the target through the pistol's sights, the world around her seemed to shift. The background noise faded away, her breathing settled into a natural rhythm, and her hands steadied with a precision that defied her apparent nervousness. The knowledge of how to aim, how to compensate for distance and weapon characteristics, how to time her shots with her breathing, all of it flowed through her without conscious thought. She fired the 10 rounds in steady succession, each shot feeling perfectly natural and controlled. When she was finished, she lowered the weapon and stepped back, once again feeling drained but oddly exhilarated by the experience. Master Sergeant Hayes activated the electronic target retrieval system, and the target came forward for examination. The 3 instructors gathered around it in complete silence, studying the results with expressions of amazement. 10 rounds, 10 hits, all within the X-ring, Sergeant Hayes announced finally. "The tightest grouping I've seen from someone firing this weapon for the first time. Hell, it's tighter than most of our advanced students achieve." One of the other instructors, a grizzled staff sergeant named Williams, shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, I've been teaching people to shoot for 20 years. What you just did should be impossible for someone with no training." "It doesn't feel like I'm doing anything special," Sarah said honestly. "When I aim at the target, everything just seems to make sense somehow." "That's exactly what makes this so remarkable," Colonel Webb said. He had been observing from the back of the range. "You're demonstrating an intuitive understanding of marksmanship principles that typically take years to develop. Over the next several hours, Sarah was tested with different weapons at various distances. Each test revealed the same impossible pattern. Despite her obvious unfamiliarity with the equipment and her awkward handling of the weapons, her actual shooting was flawless. She achieved perfect scores with rifles, pistols, and even weapons she had never seen before. The most remarkable test came when Master Sergeant Hayes led her to an outdoor range where targets were placed at distances ranging from 100 to 800 yards. Sarah was given a high-powered sniper rifle, a weapon so sophisticated that most soldiers required weeks of training just to understand its basic operation. "Ms. Bennett, I'm going to be honest with you," Sergeant Hayes said, as she helped Sarah position herself at a shooting bench. "This rifle is used by our most elite snipers. The targets at 800 yards are barely visible to the naked eye, and hitting them requires mathematical calculations for wind speed, distance, and atmospheric conditions that we normally teach over several months." Sarah peered through the advanced scope and immediately gasped. The magnification revealed details about the distant targets that seemed impossibly clear and precise. But more than that, as she studied the targets, she found herself automatically understanding factors she had never learned about. She could sense the wind direction and speed, calculate the bullet drop over the distance, and even compensate for minute atmospheric variations that would affect the shot's trajectory. "I can see exactly where to aim," she said with wonder. "I don't understand how, but I can see the path the bullet needs to take." She fired 5 shots at the 800-yard target, each one feeling as natural and controlled as if she were shooting at a target across a room. When the spotting scope confirmed 5 perfect hits, the group of military instructors fell into stunned silence. "Colonel," Staff Sergeant Williams said quietly, "in 30 years of military service, I've never seen anything like this. This lady has abilities that go beyond training, beyond experience, beyond anything I can explain." Colonel Webb nodded grimly. "Which is exactly why we need to understand what we're dealing with. Ms. Bennett, would you be comfortable if we brought in some additional specialists tomorrow? There are aspects of what you're demonstrating that require expertise beyond standard marksmanship training." "What kind of specialists?" Sarah asked. "Military psychologists who study exceptional human performance, ballistics experts who can analyze the technical aspects of your shooting, and tactical specialists who can help us understand how your abilities might be applied in real-world scenarios." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the implications of what was happening. "Colonel, I came here thinking this would be a simple evaluation, but everything you're telling me suggests that this is much more serious than I understood." "It is serious, Ms. Bennett. What you're demonstrating isn't just impressive, it's strategically significant. There are military operations, both current and potential, where someone with your natural abilities could make the difference between success and failure, between lives saved and lives lost." That evening, Sarah sat in her guest quarters trying to process everything that had happened. The tests had revealed that she possessed shooting abilities that defied explanation, but they had also opened a door to possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. She was no longer just Sarah Bennett, the quiet librarian from Millbrook. She was someone the United States military considered a strategic asset. The phone in her room rang, and she was surprised to hear Jake Morrison's voice on the other end. "Sarah, Colonel Webb gave me permission to call and check on you. How are you holding up?" "Jake, I'm not sure what's happening to me. The things they're saying about my shooting. The tests they want to run, it's all so far beyond anything I ever imagined." "I know it's overwhelming," Jake said gently, "but I want you to know that you're among good people. Colonel Webb is one of the finest officers I've ever served under, and if he thinks you're special, you are. But what if I don't want to be special? What if I just want to go back to my quiet life? That's your choice to make, and no one will force you into anything. But Sarah, what if you have the chance to save lives? What if your gift is exactly what some soldier in harm's way needs to come home safe?" After hanging up, Sarah stood at her window looking out at the base where soldiers were training for missions around the world. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more specialists, and more decisions about a future she had never imagined. But for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand that she might have something truly valuable to offer. The quiet librarian from Millbrook was discovering that she was anything but ordinary, and the world was about to discover it too. Sarah's second day at Fort Bragg began with a meeting that would change her understanding of her abilities forever. She was escorted to a secure conference room where Colonel Webb had assembled what he described as a special evaluation team. The group included Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a military psychologist specializing in exceptional human performance. Dr. James Chen, a ballistics expert from the Army Research Laboratory, and Major Patricia Stone, a tactical operations specialist who had served multiple tours in special operations. "Ms. Bennett," Colonel Webb began, "yesterday's tests confirmed that you possess marksmanship abilities that are genuinely unprecedented. Today we want to understand not just what you can do, but how you do it and what it might mean for national security applications." Dr. Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I study individuals who demonstrate exceptional abilities in various fields. What you showed us yesterday falls into a category we call intuitive mastery, the ability to perform complex tasks at an expert level without traditional training or conscious understanding of the underlying principles." "I still don't understand how I'm doing it," Sarah admitted. "When I look through the scope, everything just seems obvious. I can see exactly where the bullet needs to go, and my body knows how to make it happen." "That's exactly what makes your case so remarkable," Dr. Chen interjected. "What you're describing suggests an unconscious processing of ballistic calculations that would normally require computer assistance. You're naturally compensating for factors like wind drift, bullet drop, and atmospheric pressure without any formal knowledge of how these variables affect projectile flight." Major Stone had been quietly observing Sarah throughout the conversation. "Ms. Bennett, what I'm most interested in is how your abilities might translate to real-world scenarios. Yesterday's tests were conducted under ideal conditions: controlled environment, known distances, stationary targets. Today, I'd like to see how you perform under more challenging circumstances." The day's testing took place on Fort Bragg's most sophisticated training facilities. Sarah found herself working with scenarios that simulated real combat conditions: moving targets, unknown distances, time pressure, and environmental obstacles. Each test seemed designed to push her abilities to their limits and beyond. The most remarkable demonstration occurred on a course designed to test sniper capabilities under battlefield conditions. Sarah was positioned on an elevated platform and given targets at various distances, some partially concealed, others moving, all requiring split-second decision-making and precise shooting. The conditions that would challenge even elite military snipers seemed to pose no difficulty for her whatsoever. "Target acquisition time, less than 3 seconds. Shot accuracy, 100%, announced the range officer after each engagement. "I've never seen anything like it." But it was during a complex scenario involving multiple targets at different ranges that Sarah's abilities revealed their true extent. She was given 6 targets appearing at random intervals, each requiring different ballistic calculations and shooting positions. Not only did she hit all 6 targets perfectly, but she did so while unconsciously prioritizing them in an order that demonstrated tactical understanding she had never been taught. "Sarah," Major Stone said afterward, "you instinctively engaged the targets in the optimal sequence for maximum tactical effectiveness. You neutralized the most dangerous threats first and worked your way down the priority list. That kind of battlefield assessment typically requires years of combat training." "I didn't really think about it," Sarah replied. "I just looked at all the targets and somehow knew which ones needed to be dealt with first." The implications of what they were witnessing began to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't simply exceptional marksmanship. It was an intuitive understanding of tactics and battlefield dynamics that suggested Sarah's abilities extended far beyond shooting. That afternoon, Colonel Webb requested a private meeting with Sarah. They sat in his office as he presented her with information that would force her to confront the reality of what her newfound abilities meant. "Sarah, I'm going to share some classified information with you because I believe you have a right to understand why your abilities are so significant to us." He opened a folder marked with security classifications. "We are currently facing threats around the world where precision marksmanship of your caliber could save American lives and protect national interests. He showed her photographs and briefing documents about ongoing military operations where sniper capabilities were crucial. He explained situations where a single, precisely placed shot could prevent casualties, eliminate high-value targets, or provide crucial intelligence-gathering opportunities. There are soldiers in the field right now who are facing situations where someone with your abilities could mean the difference between mission success and failure, between coming home safely and not coming home at all, Colonel Webb said quietly. Sarah looked at the photographs of young soldiers, many not much older than the teenagers who had mocked her at the county fair just 1 week earlier. The weight of what Colonel Webb was telling her settled over her like a heavy blanket. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to consider serving your country in a capacity that utilizes your unique gifts. There are several options we could discuss, ranging from civilian contractor positions to direct military service. The specific role would depend on your comfort level and our assessment of where you could be most effective. Would I have to hurt people? Colonel Webb considered his answer carefully. In military operations, the use of lethal force is sometimes necessary to protect innocent lives and achieve legitimate objectives. However, your role would be precisely targeted and would likely save more lives than it would take. The people you might be asked to engage would be individuals who pose direct threats to American personnel or civilians. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being proposed. 1 week ago, she had been a quiet librarian whose biggest decision was which books to order for the library collection. Now she was being asked to consider becoming a military asset with capabilities that could affect national security operations around the world. I need time to think about this, she said. Of course. This isn't a decision that should be made quickly or lightly. Take all the time you need. That evening, Sarah called Mrs. Henderson from her guest quarters. Hearing her neighbor's familiar voice brought tears to her eyes as she realized how far she had traveled, both literally and figuratively, from her old life. Sarah, dear, how are you doing? The whole town is buzzing about you being called away by the military. People are saying you're some kind of secret agent now. Mrs. Henderson, I'm discovering that I might be able to do things I never knew I could do, but I'm also facing decisions that I never imagined having to make. What kind of decisions? Sarah couldn't share the classified details of what she had learned, but she tried to convey the essence of her dilemma. They want me to use my abilities to help protect soldiers and serve my country, but it would mean leaving Millbrook, leaving the library, leaving everything I've ever known. Oh, honey, that does sound frightening. But you know, your grandfather always said that sometimes ordinary people are called to do extraordinary things. He never talked much about the war, but I remember him saying that when your country needs you, you find strength you never knew you had. After hanging up, Sarah sat quietly in her room thinking about her grandfather and the medal her grandmother had mentioned. She wondered if he had faced a similar choice, a moment when his quiet life had been interrupted by the call to serve something larger than himself. The next morning brought Sarah's final evaluation, a comprehensive assessment that would determine exactly what role the military might offer her. She was tested not just on her shooting abilities, but on her psychological fitness for military service, her ability to handle classified information, and her adaptability to high-stress situations. Colonel Webb met with her afterward to present the military's formal offer. Sarah, based on 3 days of evaluation, I can tell you that you possess abilities that are strategically valuable to the United States military. We are prepared to offer you a position as a civilian contractor with the Special Operations Command, working with our most elite units on precision marksmanship operations. He outlined a compensation package that was more money than Sarah had ever imagined earning, along with comprehensive benefits and training opportunities that would develop her natural abilities to their full potential. You would work with the finest soldiers in the world, receive training from the most skilled instructors, and participate in operations that have direct impact on national security. Your assignments would be carefully selected based on your capabilities and comfort level. And if I say no, then you return to Millbrook with our thanks for your service and our promise that your abilities will remain classified. No one will ever know what we've discovered here unless you choose to tell them. Sarah looked out the window at the training facilities where soldiers were preparing for missions around the world. She thought about the young faces in the photographs Colonel Webb had shown her, soldiers who might benefit from her unique abilities. She thought about her grandfather and the choices he had made during his own time of service. She thought about the quiet life she had built in Millbrook and the extraordinary possibilities that now lay before her. Colonel Webb, if I accept this position, when would I start? Immediately. We have a situation developing overseas where someone with your capabilities could make a significant difference. You would undergo 2 weeks of intensive training here at Fort Bragg, then deploy with a special operations team to provide precision support for a critical mission. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, she saw not the frightened librarian who had stumbled through holding a rifle at the county fair, but someone who was ready to discover what she was truly capable of. Colonel Webb, I accept your offer. I want to serve my country. Outstanding, Sarah. Welcome to the team. As Sarah Bennett signed the papers that would transform her from a small-town librarian into one of America's most valuable military assets, she realized that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most ordinary moments. A week ago, she had been mocked for holding a rifle wrong at a county fair. Today, the United States Army was sending a car for her because they had discovered that she held it exactly right. The quiet woman who had lived invisible for 42 years was about to become one of the most important people her country had never heard of. And somewhere in Millbrook, a giant teddy bear sat in an empty house, the only witness to the moment when everything had changed. Sarah Bennett's old life was over. Her real life was just beginning.